There are a lot of times something in wrestling feels like an easy home run, only for that thing to then get botched. And whenever this happens then, it inevitably makes someone wonder how such a mistake could have been made. But what are the biggest fumbles in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Shinsuke Nakamura's WWE main roster run. Now, if you aren't a fan of NJPW, then it's impossible to overstate just how great Shinsuke Nakamura was over there back in the early to mid 2010s. Yes, there was a very strong argument to be made that at this particular point in time, the King of Strong Style was the best wrestler in the world. But then, when he was on the run he was here, it was hard for him to be anything different. And that's exactly why, when it was announced in mid-2016 that Shinsuke had agreed to go over to America to join the WWE roster, there was a huge amount of excitement. Would this lead to the Kyoto native tearing it up on the main roster with some of the best matches you were likely to see? Well, not exactly as it turned out, because after a decent NXT run which saw him win that brand's world title twice, Nakamura would get called up to SmackDown in 2017. And pretty quickly after that, it became clear this was no longer the same performer of old. No, after destroying his body doing New Japan's brutal style for years, Shinsuke had evidently decided that going to WWE meant he'd have a chance to take it easier on his body, and this was why he never really got out of second gear during his whole time there. Sure, there would be moments of promise, moments such as his 2018 Men's Royal Rumble win, but even that led to a pretty disappointing WrestleMania match between the former IWGP Heavyweight Champion and his old rival AJ Styles. So bad did things get for him, in fact, by the time the decade was over, the man who had headlined the Tokyo Dome multiple times over was now little more than a mid-card player in the United States title division, on the same level as people such as Rusev, Apollo Crews, and Andrade. Really then, it shouldn't be a surprise to learn that in early 2025, Nakamura had asked to be let out of his WWE contract, with his main reasoning for this being that he wanted to go over and wrestle Hiroshi Tanahashi one last time before he retired. In the end though, that didn't happen. No, for the time being, Shinsuke remains on the WWE roster, and for as long as he's there, he's probably going to continue to be fumbled. But at least he's not the only person this has happened to in modern WWE history, as the same thing could in many ways be said about our next subject, Keith Lee, and his own main roster run. That's right, the man who was absolutely tearing it up on the indies like Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and Evolve during the mid-2010s, Keith Lee was a complete phenomenon for a while. And the reason for this was because, despite being a giant of a performer, he was able to fly around the ring like a cruiserweight, much in the same way Vader had done years prior. So obviously then, when the Wichita Falls native signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2018, big things were expected of him. And luckily he'd go on to achieve these big things while a part of the NXT roster, as it was there he'd at one point briefly unify the NXT World and North American Championships. What happened after this? Well, things started to go wrong, and that's because in 2020, Lee was called up to the main roster, meaning he was from there going to be booked by Vince McMahon. And boy, did Vince do a number on the big man here, because despite him seeming like exactly the kind of guy the boss would want to push, the Limitless One immediately started faltering after reaching Raw. Not that this was his fault, however. No, given the fact he was rebranded as Bearcat Lee here, a gimmick which required him to literally growl like a bear in the ring when he was getting ready to attack his opponent, it's not surprising he failed to get over with Red Brand audiences during the lockdown. Sure, maybe a rebranding could have helped to turn things around, but there was no opportunity for Keith Lee to be rebranded here, as after spending a period on the shelf as a result of health issues very nearly resulting in fatal consequences for him, he'd be released from his contract on November 4th, 2022. Yes, just like that, the WWE main roster run of the former PWG star was over, and considering how badly it went, it's perhaps no surprise he's yet to return to WWE to this day, even when he's also been going nowhere in his current home of All Elite Wrestling. But then who knows, maybe Keith Lee does end up returning to WWE before all is said and done. Like we said, it's not like he's doing anything in AEW now, as continued health issues have seriously limited him. Hell, his wife Mi Chin remains an active part of the SmackDown roster to this day, so anything could happen. That said, until this happens, he'll always go down as a performer who was seriously fumbled on the WWE main roster. Does that make him more fumbled than our next subject though? Well, let's find out by looking at him now, the man who goes by the name of Karrion Kross. Of course, when we talk about Karrion Kross, we could talk about a couple of different examples of him being fumbled on the WWE main roster. We all remember that weird gladiator gimmick he was given in 2021 when he first appeared on Raw, right? But for the purposes of this video, it's not this example we want to focus on here. No, instead we want to focus on his treatment throughout 2025. Why 2025 specifically? Well, it was because it was here that after spending a while doing absolutely nothing, Kross started to develop something of a cult following online, and this made it seem like he was on the verge of finally having some TV success, much in the way prior online hits like LA Knight and Joe Hendry had. In the end, though, this never really came to fruition for Karrion because, outside of a storyline where he was playing something of a modern version of Chuck Palumbo's old Devil's Advocate gimmick, with most of his energy here being used on trying to turn AJ Styles and Sami Zayn to the dark side, the New York City native was barely featured at all. No, for all the talk you might see about him on places like Twitter, if you were to watch Raw or SmackDown most weeks, he was missing in action. Still though, hope remained for his fans that with 2025 being a contract year for him, his online success would be able to see him negotiate a good deal, one which would lead to a renewed push after pen had been put to paper. As you can probably guess, however, this new contract never came. No, after apparently being lowballed by TKO, Kross decided not to re-sign with the company. And this means that as things stand today, he and his wife Scarlett Bordeaux are currently free agents plying their craft on the indie circuit in places like Game Changer Wrestling. Will he get back to WWE before all is said and done? Probably, at some point. The only question will be, will WWE be able to capitalize on any momentum he has at that point and make it up to him for missing the boat on the push he could have had in 2025? We guess we'll just have to see how that one plays out, if and when it does play out. Failing a future success happening, though, Karrion Kross's legacy in WWE will no doubt remain the way he was fumbled in the mid-2020s. But then it's not like this is anything new for WWE. Hell, it's not like it's anything new for wrestling in general. And the reason we say this is because if we go all the way back to late 80s WCW, we'll find a similar situation playing out in the way that promotion botched Mean Mark Callis. Not familiar with Mean Mark Callis? Well, perhaps you'll be more familiar with him by his more commonly known name of The Undertaker. That's right, prior to joining WWF in 1990 and from there transforming into the Lord of Darkness, Mark Calaway was a young rookie trying to make a name for himself down in World Championship Wrestling. What would he be doing down there? Well, initially the big man would be part of a tag team with Dan Spivey known as the Skyscrapers. And once this ran its course, he'd have a brief singles run as a big bully heel who was managed by Paulie Dangerously. Unfortunately, though, none of those led to Mark finding any real success in WCW, with the reasons for this being that, despite his imposing size and natural charisma, his bosses at the time just didn't see him as being a star. Seriously, there was a point, right before he was fired, that the future WWE champion was told he wasn't someone who anyone was ever going to pay any money to watch. What a mistake this turned out to be then, because immediately upon arriving in WWF, The Undertaker would become a huge deal, with this continuing to be the case for 3 full decades thereafter. Come on now, in the history of wrestling, there are few people who have had more success than the Dead Man. And it shouldn't have taken a genius to figure out he had this potential within him. Evidently then, at the time booker of WCW, Ole Anderson wasn't a genius, because rather than have one of the defining figures in modern-day wrestling on his roster, he basically handed him over to the competition wrapped in a bow. Really, of all the mistakes World Championship Wrestling made over the years, this is one which doesn't get talked about enough, as the Monday Night Wars could have looked very different just a few years later if Mean Mark Callis was doing his thing under Eric Bischoff instead of being what we ended up with, The Undertaker doing his thing under Vince McMahon. Yes, there's an argument that Mark Calaway was far from a finished product when he was down in Atlanta, so he wasn't the obvious star he'd become. But part of being a good booker is recognizing when someone has potential. So this was a case where only WCW and its booking team can be blamed for not recognizing the potential the future Undertaker had here. But their loss ended up being WWF's gain, as it gave them a major weapon in their arsenal going forward. And this wasn't the only time WCW made such a mistake and handed a superstar over to their competition. Though a very similar situation could be found in what happened just a few years later when they completely fumbled Steve Austin by firing him via fax. Basically, in the early 90s, a young performer who went by the name of Stunning Steve Austin was considered one of the most promising rookies out there. Someone who, if he was treated the right way, could end up being a major star in the future. It's just a shame that Eric Bischoff never saw this then. Now, after he became booker of WCW in 1994, he'd be too busy focusing on bringing in ex-WWF talent to care about a homegrown act like Austin. And this led to Steve frittering away, doing little of nothing for a long time. Sure, he would have moments of threatening to break through, such as during his Hollywood Blondes tag team run with Brian Pillman, but even then, before the duo could get too big, Eazy-E would split them up. And this all led to the future WWF champion growing increasingly frustrated, so much so that after getting injured in early 1995, he'd have a phone call with his boss where they discussed his future in the company. Would what happened on this call help to appease the rattlesnake and make him feel like the big push was coming? No, quite the opposite in fact, because similar to what Ole Anderson had said of Mark Calloway a few years prior, Bischoff would tell Austin here that he just wasn't marketable and was never going to be a star. Basically, this is the wrestling equivalent of Dick Rowe, the man who in 1962 infamously neglected to sign the Beatles. It's just a staggering misread of where things were going because, as we all know now, Steve Austin would go on to become arguably the biggest star in all of wrestling history, and the driving force behind the boom period WWF would enjoy during the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's all made even worse by the fact that when WCW did fire Steve not long after his final phone conversation with Eazy-E, they do so by fax. Yes, so little did the company think of the six-time WWF champion here, they didn't even do him the decency of releasing him to his face. But even that wouldn't be the last time Eric Bischoff and co. would fail to recognize the future potential of a young rookie who they ended up handing over to the competition instead. No, this would also happen with our next subject, Jean-Paul Levesque. That's right, as you can probably guess, Jean-Paul Levesque is the gimmick name which was given to Paul Levesque back when he was working in WCW during the early 90s, with the idea here being that, playing off his French heritage, the future Game was now being cast in the role of a snobby French aristocrat. And while this would lead to him getting some notable things to do, such as his tag team run with Lord Steven Regal, in the end, that wasn't enough for the future chief content officer of WWE. No, he wasn't a fan of World Championship Wrestling's limited schedule back then, as he felt it didn't give him enough room to improve in the ring. So for that reason, when he was negotiating a new contract in early 1995, things came to a bit of an impasse. Could Eric Bischoff have done more to keep Levesque happy here, perhaps by putting him on TV more or allowing him to work with partners like New Japan Pro Wrestling? Yes. And if he had done this, there's a good chance the future WWE champion would have never left for WWE in the first place. But this was not the way things played out, likely because, like the way he saw Steve Austin, Eazy-E just didn't see a big future in the Greenwich native. Of course, as we all know now though, that was a major mistake because by the time the new millennium was dawning, Triple H would be one of the biggest stars in all of WWE. And that's a status he would keep for the rest of his in-ring career and beyond, as today he's the guy booking the whole show. Really then, there's no other way of looking at this one other than to call it a fumble because while we're not going to sit here and tell you a more heavily pushed Jean-Paul Levesque would have stopped WCW from going under in 2001 or anything, it would have provided the promotion with a powerful weapon in their arsenal during the Monday Night Wars, all while taking that same weapon away from the competition. But then that was so much of the issue with World Championship Wrestling by the end. Their focus was always too much on past stars of the 80s and never enough on pushing young new talent like WWF had been able to do with performers such as Steve Austin, The Rock, and many others around the same time. But let's move away from WWE and WCW for a moment and over to another promotion instead, TNA. They have plenty of examples of fumbling something themselves, and one of the bigger instances of this would be the time they botched our next subject, the mighty Monty Brown. Now, if you were a wrestling fan during the mid-2000s, you likely remember Monty Brown as being the guy who felt like he was a surefire future superstar, someone who had all the skills required to make it to the top. After all, he'd already shown his athletic skills on the gridiron during notable runs with both the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots. And given he was very much a TNA guy, there was a sense that if they could make the most out of him, Brown could be a performer who could help them to one day compete with WWE. Unfortunately though, like with so many other people we've looked at today, this potential was never realized. And the reason for that was because instead of rocketing him up to the top of the card and having him be the new ace of the fledgling promotion, TNA decided to stall and play games with the audience who were looking to see a hot young star get his due. That's right, despite having him challenge then NWA World's Champion Jeff Jarrett for the gold on multiple occasions, the company would never pull the trigger on having Monty Brown win the big one, and that all led to a situation where eventually fans just stopped believing in him. And because they waited so long to pull the trigger then, by the time 2006 came around and Brown had to step away from the industry for a while in order to deal with some family issues, the boat had been well and truly missed. Yes, the next time any of us saw Monty, he'd be appearing on WWE TV as Marcus Corvon, the newest member of the WWECW roster. And while there, he'd be pretty badly botched too, as it happened, but that's not the part of the big man's career we're focusing on right now. No, instead we're focusing on the fact that TNA let such a potential game changer for them slip right through their fingers when they were in such desperate need of game-changing figures. If we want to focus on another WWE-related fumble when it comes to their booking of a talent, we'll have to move on to our next subject instead. Someone who was on a hell of a roll back during 2010, but who had all of his momentum completely trampled over by his bosses. Who are we talking about here? Why, Zack Ryder, of course. Zack Ryder. What could have been? Come on now. Well, it's easy to forget today. There was a period back at the beginning of the 2010s where Long Island Iced Z was arguably the most over person on the entire roster. Really then, it seemed simple when it came to what to do next. All WWE had to do was give the New Yorker a strong push up the card. But that never happened in the end. No, while Vince McMahon would begrudgingly push Ryder for a little while, it was only for a little while. And once the whole thing was done, the would-be superstar was in a worse state than he'd been at the beginning. Why was that? Well, because this was one of those rare examples of an actual burial. Yes, whenever your favorite mid-card act doesn't get enough wins, that's not really a burial, rather it's just booking. In Matt Cardona's case, however, it seemed like he was specifically being punished for having the gall to get over without WWE's express written consent. And so that's how we got a situation where, after his on-screen girlfriend was stolen by John Cena and his leg was kayfabe injured, leaving him in a wheelchair, Zack Ryder would suffer the final indignity of being pushed off the entrance ramp by Kane like he was a common piece of trash. What a waste this was then, because there was a lot more that could have been done with the current King of the Indies here. Fans already believed in him, and that's the hardest thing to do, but alas, by the time he was 6 feet under booking-wise, none of those fans cared enough to keep chanting his name anymore. No, by 2011, the Ryder revolution was most definitely over. And while Zack would eventually get a one-night token Intercontinental title win down the line, he'd never become as big as he could have been, as for the rest of his days in WWE, he'd primarily be treated like a glorified enhancement talent. And he's not the only person who managed to gain a lot of momentum in WWE, only to then fall into a pretty reduced role. And we say that because our next subject went down an almost identical path when he made his return to Vince McMahon's promotion in 2002. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Scott Steiner? Seriously, this one felt like such an open goal, it's amazing things were fumbled so much. After all, when he evolved away from his early varsity athlete gimmick during the late 90s and instead transformed into Big Papa Pump, a sentient, veiny mass of muscle with the soul of a poet, Scott Steiner would turn into one of the biggest stars World Championship Wrestling had during its dying days. Obviously then, when WCW went under in 2001, it was believed it would only be a matter of time until the Michigan native reappeared in WWE. And this would eventually happen at the 2002 Survivor Series in November of that year. What happened after this? Well, while you might assume the big bad booty daddy went on to have another lengthy run on top, pretty quickly it became apparent this was not going to happen. And at least the initial reason for that was because he ran into a Triple H-shaped brick wall. That's right, this was during the game's infamous Reign of Terror, the period where, in an attempt to put himself on the same level of The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, Paul Levesque spent the better part of 3 years going over everyone in sight, usually in a way that completely buried his opponents by the time all was said and done. And Scott Steiner was not immune to meeting this fate as it happened, because when he started a World Heavyweight title feud with Triple H in January of 2003, he would not manage to make it out alive, as his opponent would chew him up and spit him out. So bad would things get, in fact, Big Papa Pump wouldn't even make the WrestleMania card that year. And as the second half of 2003 arrived, he'd be reduced to playing the role of mid-card rival and occasional tag team partner to Test, not exactly where anyone expected him to be less than a year after his re-debut. What could have been done differently to make Steiner's run better here? Well, it would have probably required him to be in better ring shape if we're being honest, or who knows, maybe all Vince McMahon had to do was to hide the big man's weaknesses and accentuate his positives by having him be more of a Goldberg-esque monster who could have short, impressive bouts instead of the lengthier ones he was having. It would have surely helped a little bit at least. After all, not everyone can be a work rate king in the ring, so not everyone should be put in a position to deliver in that sense. But even if you are one of the better wrestlers in the world, this still doesn't guarantee WWE won't fumble you. And if you need a perfect example of that, you need only look towards our next subject, Ricky Steamboat. Now, it's widely accepted today that Ricky Steamboat was one of the best wrestlers to grace the halls of WWF during the Golden Era. Hell, his famous WrestleMania 3 match against Macho Man Randy Savage for the Intercontinental title was arguably the first great bout of the Vince McMahon Jr. period. And given this was the same match where the Dragon was able to dethrone Savage and take the mid-card prize away for his own, it would have seemed like a given here that he'd from there go on a lengthy babyface run with the gold. But that's not what happened. No, instead, a mere 2 months after winning the gold, Ricky would be dropping it to the Honky Tonk Man. Why was that? Well, ever the consummate family man, not long after he became champion, Steamboat had asked his boss if he could have some time off as his wife was about to give birth to their first child. But after deciding this was something he wasn't happy about, Vince McMahon instead chose to punish his new champ by having him drop the gold in short order. And after that, things would never be the same for Ricky in WWF again, as from there on in, he'd get the feeling he was being buried, with this all leading to him leaving in 1988 and heading back over to World Championship Wrestling instead. How would WCW utilize the Dragon now that they had him back on their roster? A lot better, as it happened, because this was the period of Steamboat's iconic trilogy with Ric Flair over the NWA World's title. So if there ever was an example of how much WWF missed the boat on letting the New Yorker take some time off to see his son being born, all before then bringing him back and having him steal the show every night, this was it. Really, effectively handing over someone of the level of him to your competition should be considered booking malpractice. And things didn't get much better for the eternal babyface once he had his second run in WWF in 1991. No, evidently still upset about the way things had gone before, Vince McMahon did not push Ricky as he should have been pushed during this go-around either. Rather, he treated him like a mid-card act whose gimmick was now that he was supposed to be a literal dragon who breathed fire during his entrance. What a waste that was, as even at this point, Steamboat could have been a top-level guy. Hell, he could have even been a world champion. But we guess that's just the way things go sometimes. People get fumbled, and companies miss out on something special as a result. It's not the first time it's happened in wrestling, and it certainly won't be the last.